Hey, let's just start by introducing everybody and talking about what our experience here is in this field. And let's just, assuming everybody's videos are lined up the same way, let's just start at the top left with Brennan there.
Sure. My name is Brennan Smith, but I go by Talonos online. I'm the director and game design lead of a small indie game studio called Space Heater Games. We recently just released our first game. It's called Final Winter, and it's a time attack dungeon crawler. It's available on Steam as of 8 days ago today. And before that, I worked making Minecraft mod packs on commission for Technic. The mod pack that I made that's had the most downloads is called Blightfall. It's a quest-driven mod pack, also had some dungeons in it, small ones, and it had 2 million downloads. And that's where I'm coming from.
Brian, why don't you introduce yourself while I put Brennan's game on my wish list?
Hi, I'm Brian Weiser. I do a little of everything. Most recently, I've been with the Call Apple user group. It's an old user group from 1978, producing a lot of retro computing gaming books. Gaming specifically, I've produced an autobiography with Robert Clardy from Synergistic Software, which did create a lot of the early dungeon crawler games like Wilderness Campaign, Dungeon Campaign, things like that. I've also produced a Firefly documentary, if there's any Firefly fans out there. And I'm a big gamer.
James, why don't you bring us home?
All right, James Eck. I came late to the dungeon crawler game with Dungeon Master 2 on my dad's Mac OS, and was absolutely ecstatic to rejoin that feeling with more recent games like Grimrock 2, and Bard's Tale 4.
Awesome. I suspect my first dungeon crawler might have been either Bard's Tale 1 or the Dungeons of Aklabeth, whatever that first Ultima game was, the one that was before Ultima 1. And I've been playing dungeon crawlers ever since. I remember Dungeon Master vividly, just vividly. Just the joy of having your whole party die and the monsters be stacked up behind the dead bodies and then hurling dead body parts at them until you finally survive and then getting a level of ninja because of it. It was a great game. But I think I just answered my own first question. What's all your favorite classic dungeon crawl game? And tell us why you love it, why it holds a special place in your heart. Why don't we start with James this time? We'll go the other direction.
Sure. So the only true classic that I remember playing is that Dungeon Master 2. Mm-hmm. And the thing that really sticks with me from that game is the spell building system, where you build the spells up. And of course, it was the only thing you could level up in without actually fighting enemies. And so you could level up in the town and then go out and fireball everything to death with all of 4 of your characters. But that spell system has been heavily inspired my custom spell system that I currently game master with in my homebrew. It's the whole reason I made my homebrew, was because of the Dungeon Master 2 spell system. So heavy influence there. I really enjoyed that.
I suspect that as we go that you'll find out that Brian and I consider classic games some games that
well, there's pinball and
Diablo came out a long time ago.
That's true. Does Diablo count?
Well, and that's the thing, is that when we're talking about dungeon crawlers, what counts as the dungeon crawler? When I played the first I guess it was the second Elder Scrolls game, Daggerfall, you spend 75% of your time in dungeons, and so that could count as a dungeon crawler. But on the other hand, it sort of kicked off the Western RPG scene, so at least the modern ones. So it makes me wonder, where do dungeon crawlers start and end? Because there are a lot of games I could list down as favorites that might be.
There's yeah.
I'm going to tell you about a review I read of Daggerfall when we're done here, but let's forget everybody's favorites first. Brian, what's your favorite?
Well, picking one is so hard. Some of the first games I played, of course, Zork, one of the first text adventures from Infocom, definitely a dungeon crawler, even though it's pure text, interactive storytelling. Wizardry, I spent so many hours trying to build up my characters so they wouldn't just die off immediately like they often did. And then the third one I'll mention quickly is probably the most obscure title, Castles of Darkness. It only sold a few thousand copies, but man, was it good. And it sure sucked me in. And that was probably one of the first really early semi-3D dungeon crawlers.
Awesome. So, Brennan, what's your...
My favorite is going to definitely be the Might and Magic series. And
I love you. I love you. Can we bond? Can we? Yeah.
Definitely. And the other ones that I'm thinking of is Lindley's Dungeon Crawl, which eventually morphed into Dungeon Crawl Clone Soup. And I'm going to be a little controversial here, but I really enjoyed Doom as a dungeon crawler.
No, I'd qualify it. I mean, it was a shooter, but I mean, what else was it but a dungeon crawl? That was
exactly. It was a dungeon crawler in which you were playing a first-person shooter, but it's you went through dungeons. That's all you did the entire game. So,
I mean, a lot of those old games.
They certainly look like dungeons.
A lot of the old like Ultima Underworld game was basically a first-person shooter where you were using swords and arrows instead of, same with the original Dungeon Master. I think wasn't really that turn-based.
Hexen and Heretic,
very much real time.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. So when Daggerfall came out, there was a review that said, and every game you get to the point where you say you're tired of something in the game. You say like, not another orc, or not another conversation, or not another city. In Daggerfall, the word is corridor. Anybody's played Daggerfall will understand why. Okay. So what about them attracted you, and what kept your interest? Now, if you're old enough, by the way, this is Lady Fluffington von Furryface, and she has opinions, so you might hear from her during the panel. What attracted you, and if you're old enough, you might not have had many options, but especially for our younger panelists. Hello. Yeah, the kitty did that. For our younger panelists, why don't you answer the question, and I'll get my setup back to.
So for me, what initially attracted to them is that my mother and father were, I guess you could call them casual gamers, in that they only had a few hours in the evening to play. And when they played, they wanted to load up a game, kill monsters, and then shut it off again. And they loved Might and Magic for that, because they would just say, which dungeon are we going to do today? We're going to go this one. They would go in and, Inferno and Ring of Fire and just kill the monsters. And then that was a satisfying evening. And so that's sort of what I grew up with. And I sort of needed to start from there and diverge into other games that were a little more complex than my parents would want to play. But that was, I guess you could say, dungeon crawlers were my introduction to gaming.
All right. Awesome. Let's get the youngins first, because me and Brian might not have a great answer. James, what's your answer?
Yeah, Dungeon Master 2. Of all the games that were on that old Mac, Dungeon Master 2 was the only one that had an extensive pamphlet that I could read when I wasn't allowed to be playing video games. Mm-hmm. So it was the game that I could play all day, every day. I'd take that pamphlet with me in the car and take it to school and just read it and read it and read it, and try to figure out what spells I could make the next time I played. And so it was the only game that I could take outside of my normal gaming time.
Okay, Brian, did you have a lot of options when you started? I mean, my game selections were so slim.
When I started, and the internet didn't exist yet, and we had BBSs to call and socialize, with our modems, computer to computer, trying to discover, getting recommendations that way. It was the Wild West of early computers, really. But certainly Zork sucked me in. Just the interactive novel, seeing what would work, how smart or stupid the parser was. Well, why don't you understand this word? Okay, well, let's try to figure out what words, what vocabulary. But the whole interactive novel, being in the novel, using my mind to create the landscape, not seeing the graphics, I found that very invigorating. But just as well, the simple line style graphics in Wizardry, navigating through the maze, being surprised with the text that would pop up on the screen, or the primitive graphic you would see of a monster that just surprised you. So for me, it was just the sense of adventure and discovery and figuring out what was possible within the system beyond the adventure itself.
So let's talk about like story versus gameplay, because a lot of the original dungeon crawls were pretty light on story. Not all of them, but a lot of them were.
Certainly in Dungeon Master 2, you mostly just had the prologue in the pamphlet that I read a million times, and then
right.
You wrote the rest of that from there in your head.
Let's just have your thoughts on that. Right. I don't have a specific question there. I just want to get your thoughts on that, especially as people who've seen it evolve through the years. Because like Diablo is the first real dungeon crawler I saw that had a fairly evolved story with big cutscenes and the like. Can you think of one before that? I mean, maybe the Ultimas, if you call them dungeon crawlers. They had a lot of above ground stuff.
I don't know. I keep coming back to the text adventures. I mean, every screen where you went into practically with the descriptions that were presented and the interactivity you had with objects, you were reading story as you were going. So in that sense, yes, but I would certainly agree that over time, those games and really any games have developed more story. It's just the natural progression of things as systems get more capable and more complex, that you're going to have more opportunities to present more story. And I think that's the way things have gone. Yeah,
I couldn't tell you anything about Zork's story other than you find a house and there's a dungeon under it,
Yeah, there's a little more to it, but that's still basically it.
Adventure ensues. That's all I can tell you about Zork's story.
Open mailbox.
You have anything to add, Brennan?
Yeah, I was just thinking that at this point we start running into definitional things again. For instance, in the modern Final Fantasy remake, one of the complaints that it received is that the dungeon sequences were too long, especially when you're underneath the Midgar plate. And like that whole stretch from when you're going from jumping off the train all the way to the next reactor, they say, oh yeah, there were like 2 extra dungeons in there that they didn't used to have that didn't need to be there. So it's like, okay, but Final Fantasy VII Remake is obviously a very plot and character-driven game, but it still had the dungeons in it. So when we're talking about, like, have dungeon crawlers evolved to have more story in it, at what point do you transition from a dungeon crawler to a story-based RPG? And does the line even matter? Or do we just say now people are more okay putting dungeons into their RPGs or narrative into their dungeon crawlers?
Well, I would posit, and I'm putting this out there for you to comment on, that you can definitely take steps backwards. Like Baldur's Gate came out, and then the Pool of Radiance 2 came out, and I could not play Pool of Radiance 2 because it was nothing but one big dungeon with no story, and I had already played Baldur's Gate and maybe Baldur's Gate 2. And trying to play Pool of Radiance 2 was just horrific. It was just so boring. Because
Are you talking about Ruins of Myth Draenor?
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't get past level 4 in that one just because it's like, okay.
Yeah, and it's just because they didn't keep up with where the industry was, I think. What are your thoughts? Do you obviously you agree with me, Brennan? Anybody else?
I can't speak to those games.
I was just going to comment on the Final Fantasy VII remake. I was just going to say, with the Final Fantasy VII remake, maybe with those extra dungeons, the game was lacking an editor, and they needed somebody to go in and copy edit out that and have a more focused game. Games need editors too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Brian, if I cut you off, just talk over me. We got a little lag on your audio. So just feel free to just run right over me and I'll stop talking.
Okay.
James, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Talking about story, the Legend of Grimrock game, when I think nostalgia and dungeon crawls, it's all the way back to Dungeon Master 2. And the Legend of Grimrock game went back to that, where it was the whole story was your prisoners who have been dropped off at the top of this dungeon and try to make it out alive, right? And it's one big long dungeon. Of course, Legend of Grimrock 2, they added a little bit more story, right? There was an enemy that was taunting you as you went along, as you tried to find your way into his sanctum. But I think that there's a lot of charm to that lack of story because it lets you write your own story. Yeah, we were just the prisoners in Legend of Grimrock, but I would give personalities to my 4 characters and have them talk with each other as they approach different situations, doing all the voices for my own entertainment. And the story develops that way. Even if all it is a group of people trying to get alive, I start to put some personality into them. And it's something that I wouldn't be able to do in a game where the personality's already been put there.
There's certainly something to be said for the silent protagonist and acting as a mirror for whatever we want him to be.
That being said, there are some games that, because the story isn't the point, they really try to either eliminate or at least sort of hide the story. I'm thinking of Slay the Spire. That's it. Slay the Spire is a card-based dungeon crawler, and there's some story. You can read it between the lines, and occasionally it gives you a paragraph here or there, just randomly generated. But at its core, you're just going through a dungeon, and I think that's because it's trying to go for a certain kind of gameplay fantasy for which a story is not important.
And that reminds me of Dark Souls, where you can get people making whole careers out of trying to interpret the story out of Dark Souls because there's hints, but there's no connecting tissue.
When really the game is about killing monsters.
Exactly. Yep.
There's nothing wrong with that.
So let's go back to Final Fantasy for a moment, because that brings up an interesting question that I want to touch on. Western and Asian game designers have some very different ideas on story and story structure and stuff. Who do you think does the dungeon crawl better? Do you have any opinions on that?
Depends on what other things you're looking for. Okay. I think that it was in the Dungeon Master's Guide 3rd edition when they were trying to explain to newbie dungeon masters what a dungeon was. It's like a dungeon is, in essence, a series of rooms with challenges in them for the players to overcome, which, if you think about it in that way, games are all about dungeons. Portal is a dungeon, and just anything is a dungeon. And so I think that it's not so much about who does dungeon crawlers better, but what are you looking for in your dungeon crawler, and what do you want, whether or not the West or Asia is better at giving you that. If you want sort of open world sandboxy dungeon crawlers, then yeah, Bethesda is great. Everyone who's going down the Wizardry lineage, that they're great. But if you want something more tightly narrative focused, where it tells a story about a given character, I think that Asia's still doing somewhat better on that.
Yeah. Any other comments? Strong. I don't play too many besides the Final Fantasy games, so I don't have a lot of opinions outside that one storyline. Anyone else have anything they want to add? Okay, well, we'll just move on.
I agree.
Sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. Hey, if you cover it, you cover it.
I just don't know enough about the difference between Western and Eastern to say whether one game's Western and another's Eastern.
We're talking about anime and how they deal with story structure different, in an anime movie as opposed to a Western movie. I could talk about the 3-act structure versus whatever that is they call the anime structure a lot, because it's very different. But I haven't really studied.
Give me something to Google. I'm very curious about that. But
yeah, yeah, I would give you something to Google. Let's talk about the evolution of the dungeon crawl, because we've mentioned some games that pulled it out, I think I mentioned Ultima and Diablo. Let's discuss how the game dungeon crawl evolved over time. What are some landmarks in the dungeon crawl's evolution that you guys can think of?
Rogue.
I have that on my list. Why don't you explain how Rogue was an evolution to those who might not know?
Okay, so Rogue's big thing is that it's procedurally generated and it has permanent death, which makes it so that every time you play, and by permanent death, I mean like if your character dies, they're dead. There are no saved games. You can't reload and try something again. So because of that, every time that you went in, it was a brand new dungeon and it was a test of your gaming skills instead of a story or a packaged experience. And especially when you're just starting off, you would die like over and over and over again as you start to learn the system. The best I could think of as an example these days is like Don't Starve. How Don't Starve, they just sort of drop you in with no tutorials and you poison yourself and get eaten by wolves. Like it's meant to be something that you discover through experience and through failure. And that kicked off an entire genre of similar games called roguelikes. And roguelikes all have some form of permanent death and some form of randomly generated content. And sort of the appeal of those is that when you open up a chest, you don't know what's in it because it's randomly generated each time. So it could be junk or it could be one of the best weapons in the game. And so there's sort of that like gambling thrill of discovery every time you do it. One of the best modern roguelikes I can think of for the younger audience is Enter the Gungeon, I think is a good example of a modern roguelike.
And part of the big appeal of that roguelike structure nowadays is there's no wiki that you can go look up to find out where to get the best items and what the best build is, because it's procedurally generated. You're on your own, and that's a fun feeling.
You need to make up your build as you go along.
To some extent, like I think Darkest Dungeon would be considered a roguelike, and there are assumptions you can make off the because you have classes in there. So like there are party builds sometimes in certain roguelikes. And I think most people consider Hades a roguelike, but that doesn't actually have permadeath, really. Because it's got its own thing going on. But no, I love I love Hades. I don't like roguelikes. What are you gonna say?
Did the Rogue game start out on mainframes? You know, where Zork started out really as Colossal Cave Adventure written on mainframes, and then there were games like Telengard that were originally written for mainframes, and then brought forward. Did the Rogue start on mainframes?
It did. I think that they even had a feature in which if your character died, other people who played on that same mainframe could run into your character's ghost as a monster. And
that's awesome.
That's awesome.
I thought you were going to say that they could loot your body.
Yeah.
Version 2.
So we got Rogue. What are some other big landmarks in the dungeon crawl evolution? Anybody have something they want to call out?
I just threw out Colossal Cave Adventure, but
I don't remember Colossal Cave Adventure. What was it like?
Well, it basically is what became Zork. So
Zork precursor. And that's interesting because it's like a completely different genre. It's not about like killing monsters and getting XP. It's a lot more puzzle and exploration based.
Right.
I thought you mentioned, oh man, why am I losing it? Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate was a big step. I don't know if I'm skipping steps, but Baldur's Gate brought you to the over the head.
We don't have to go
heavy story.
Jump around. Baldur's Gate. That was the game. 8 CDs, 12 CDs or something. I think it was 8 CDs. Yeah.
After the Tales of the Sword Coast, yeah.
Yeah.
The real time with pause gameplay. I love that.
There's always Wasteland that turned into Fallout later on.
Yes. Yeah. Wasteland. I've never played the original Wasteland, but I've heard great things about it. You have the Ultima games, which, eventually turned into their whole thing that were kind of non-dungeon crawls anymore. Well, and then went back to like full dungeon crawl at one point, right? I think,
was Wizardry a dungeon crawl? I haven't played that game.
I believe so. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah, I haven't played it in so many years.
Yeah.
I'm going to hop back in and say Doom again for popularizing the first-person interface through which many subsequent dungeon crawlers like Arena, Daggerfall, Morrowind came through.
Yeah, and just cheating on the 3D graphics to like give you like a fake 3D. I mean, it was brilliant technically,
I really enjoyed Black Crypt on the Amiga.
Oh, okay. I don't know that one. I don't know what was that like.
Kind of like a Bard's Tale, but a little more animation.
Oh, let's talk about Bard's Tale. Bard's Tale had the original one was just one giant dungeon with the town above it. You could only save, I think, at the Adventurers Guild, if I remember correctly. You could only save there. You could only level there. And then
in Bard's Tale 1, I tried to play the remake, and I got repeatedly killed in the town. Is that normal?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not unnormal, at least. Yeah.
On the plus side, you weren't playing the original Apple II GS release, where they didn't have time to finish programming it, so they released it incomplete, figuring, well, people probably won't get to the end anyway.
Really? Wow.
They underestimate our dedication.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, it was rough. Bard's Tale 2 added cities with dungeons under each city. And then 3 was like planes of existence with dungeons in each one. So you could kind of see the evolution of the dungeon crawl just through Bard's Tale in some ways. Yeah. All right. I think I've beat that one to death.
I was going to add, and we were talking evolution. This might be more of a mutation, but the MMOs with World of Warcraft, where the dungeon crawl becomes a collective effort.
That's a super good point.
And that comes from the old BBS MUDs that Brian was mentioning. I don't know if you know this, but
it's even in the name, multi-user dungeon.
When EverQuest came out, all of the MUD commands still worked. My buddy Gary used to, when they'd go to there's a dungeon down in the swamp in the south, and there's a boss in the bottom level, and you'd be like, I don't know if he's up or not. We don't want to have to fight our way all the way down. And Gary's like, I know a trick. And because he knew that on a MUD, if you sent a tell to a boss and they were up, it wouldn't respond, but you'd get a different error than if they didn't exist. And so he would use that MUD trick. And for the first release or two of EverQuest, until one of the patches came out, all of those MUD tricks worked because it was built on an old MUD engine, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's why people still call them mobs, which is a MUD term for mobile monster, because you had the stable monsters and the mobile monsters. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of the user, there's always Gauntlet, which is quite different.
Oh
but
yeah,
definitely a group of people working together and trying to kill everything.
Warrior shot the food. Yes.
Wizard did badly.
Yes.
The 4-player version of Gauntlet in the arcade was the best.
Absolutely. I played hours of that. So a lot of those arcade. Anybody have arcade dungeon crawls they love, like Golden Axe?
I love Golden Axe. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it counted.
Why not? Let's bring it up now.
It's so linear.
Linear's okay.
Yeah. So which of these games would you go back and play right now if you could? If I locked you on a desert island with only classic dungeon crawl games, which ones would you put on your list?
I'd go back to Dungeon Master 2 for sure, but I went back and replayed Golden Axe for some reason recently. I don't remember how.
Brennan, Brian?
I think I'd pick some new ones in order to learn more about them. I think I'd pick the Wizardry series.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, fill in some holes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd probably do the Wizardry or try the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I love the original on the PlayStation, so.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, that kind of brings me into my next question. What of these, are there any of these old games you wish were remade that haven't been yet, like Final Fantasy VII? I really enjoyed Bard's Tale 4. I was
Yeah, Bard's Tale 4 was really good.
Get great reviews, but I loved it. I loved going back to the Bard's Tale.
I might replay
was pretty
that.
good, even though Might and Magic 9 was a disaster.
Yeah. What was the last Might Magic that they released crowdfunding? Was that 10?
10, yeah.
Yeah. I played it twice.
I don't know if this counts, but the good old Dragon's Lair Laserdisc from Don Bluth is kind of a dungeon crawl, but man, that's such a pain, which takes all the fun out of it. And what I always wished is that you actually had full interactivity in an animated looking dungeon like that. That's the game I always wanted to play. Not what we played as Dragon's Lair.
One of the things that keeps on coming up in How Did This Get Played is when he'll be talking about an old game from when we were kids like that. And he'll say, we didn't understand at the time the difference between a game that was just hard and a game that was poorly designed.
And a game that was designed to collect your quarters.
May I propose a question?
Yeah, sorry?
I said, may I propose a question?
Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
I think that a lot of the people in the audience have come to LTUE looking to learn. So I would like to ask, what can we learn from the evolution of dungeon crawlers that we can apply in our own games?
Like in
what lessons does this teach us?
Like in our tabletop games?
Tabletops, video, whatever games we make, whatever our preferred media is. For me, that would be video games.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm a tabletop game designer, so for me that would be No, that's great. That's a great question. Let's start on the right here. What do you think, James?
Some of them had really high quality dungeon design. I think it would be worthwhile to go back and remap some of those, kind of like we do for Ocarina of Time and like Metroid, and see what there is to learn about their dungeon design. But the other thing is that everything comes back around, right? You've got this dungeon crawl renaissance where you've got Bard's Tale 4 being remade and Legend of Grimrock trying to be Dungeon Master. And so it's worth looking at your past to see what you loved so that you can bring it back for other people to love.
Well, one of the things I really liked about games that it was more popular in the olden days with more physical products, coming back again to the Infocom text adventures, all of the feelies that came in the original product box. So not just the manual, but like on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there was an empty plastic bag that was your microscopic space fleet, and little sunglasses and little dial or compass you had to put together in the Trinity text adventure. Physical things that made an appearance in the game or helped you figure out clues in the game, combining the best of both worlds. I want to see more feelies, more physical products, cloth maps, things like that.
The Ultima 4 cloth map. I loved the Ultima 4 cloth map. Yeah.
Or the coins in Ultima 1, or just something to give the world a little more substance.
Yeah.
And beyond that, when designing games, I mean, every game needs challenges, but a lot of the games we've talked about, there's a certain degree of frustration and monotony, and it would be nice if there was a limited amount so people didn't get frustrated and bored too easily, and there were challenges, but they weren't impossible. At least not and maybe different avenues for winning.
Since you asked the question, I'm going to answer it. Nicholas Myers, when he did Star Trek II, said that one of the reasons why Star Trek II was such a good movie is he had such a low budget. Because Star Trek I was so expensive because they had folded 2 projects' budgets into it. And he said that when you have a lot of limitations, you have to think very creatively. I would say that one of the best things about these old games is looking back over their creative solutions to their technical and storytelling limitations, and how they came up with just some like fabulous plot twists and puzzles with what they had. Yeah. And try to mine those for ideas.
I love that so much.
And why don't you answer your own question, Brendan?
Okay, I thought that the rule was just if he starts talking, let him talk over us. So
yeah, that's true.
But as for my question, I was thinking that for me, you could tell what's important to the formula and what's not by seeing what stayed the same and what has changed. I think that in modern dungeon crawlers, you've got a lot of things that are just quality of life features, in interface improvements, things like that. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of stuff that still is mostly unchanged since the classics. And I think that being able to see how, while it has been evolving, what has stayed the same can help you determine what things were mistakes that have been fixed and what things are important to keep in other games moving forward.
Great. That's a great answer. I don't care if you don't have an answer to this one, but I'm just going to toss it out there. We talked about games that you'd like to see remade. Are there any that you just don't want touched? Like sacred, do you have any sacred cows you'd never want to see them go back to? If you don't have,
too late.
Yeah. I don't really have an answer for that one myself. But.
Well, I don't know. I was really excited for Baldur's Gate 3 until it was turn-based. So I say too late.
Okay. When you get to be my age, you'll be thankful.
Well, there was the pause, right? You could queue up your actions.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole trend of game design that's all about punishing people whose hands are over 40.
So when I think about sacred cows, I'm thinking to myself, I don't think that there is a game that I would not want to see remade right. And I tend to be overly optimistic. And so when I hear about a new thing coming out, I get all excited about it until it disappoints me. And I still haven't learned my lesson yet. And because of that, I lack sacred cows.
Well, honestly, I mean, the old game is always still there. So what does it hurt if they try?
True.
Okay, well, producer, do you have some questions for us? I feel free, like this would be a great time to open up some questions.
Yes, first question is, you've mentioned both Portal and Doom in the context of dungeon crawlers. Do you think that there are any kind of settings that dungeon crawls shouldn't touch, or is it open to all? And if so, what kind of setting do you think works best for dungeon crawls?
So I feel as though it depends on how you define the term dungeon crawl. If you go back to the original definition that I mentioned in the Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition Dungeon Master's Guide that said that a dungeon is like a series of rooms, each containing a challenge, then you could even consider a lot of town-based, exploration-based adventures in the tabletop setting to be a dungeon. You know, once you go and you talk to the Duke, then that is like a room that then has an exit to talk to the Duke's wife and confront her about his infidelity, or go talk to the page in order to, you know what I mean? Because a lot of times each given challenge can spread out into other similar challenges, and you can diagram anything out like a flow chart, which makes it look very much like a dungeon. And so when you're saying, are there any settings that are particularly good or particularly bad, or any formats such as first-person shooter, text-based adventure, over-the-top, turn-based with pausing, are there any formats that are better or worse than dungeons? I think that it depends on what ancillary fantasies you're also trying to hit as well, and what sort of gameplay experience that you're looking at.
Yeah, you ask, are there any settings that it doesn't suit? And I thought really hard for a second and said, well, what if you had tried to do a dungeon crawl inside the human body? And I went, wait, no, that's Magic School Bus. Yeah, you can do whatever you want.
Anything to add, Brian?
No.
All right, next question.
All right. Next question. You did mention roguelikes or roguelites earlier. We've seen a lot of those come into existence recently, mostly from indie game developers. Do you think that this means dungeon crawlers are making a comeback in popular media? And if so, what do you think the future of the, we'll call it genre, would be?
I feel as though part of the reason why they're making a comeback is all of the people who grew up with video games as their primary source of entertainment. People like, around our age who were school children when all the big classics hit. They don't have as much time anymore, and so they are looking for encapsulated experiences. And so a roguelike sort of thing that you can play in an hour or two after the kids have gone to bed, but before you go to bed, is like an ideal chunk of time. And for you to be like dead afterwards, so you don't even have to worry about it anymore when you're at work, I think fits a lot of people's schedules really well. I don't necessarily think that there's some like cultural zeitgeist that's pushing back towards dungeon crawlers. I just think that the dungeon crawler format, especially a roguelite dungeon crawler format, is matching the time that people have available. And I'm kind of interested in what happens when we become seniors and have all the time in the world again. Like, what will games be like then? What will come back then?
It'll be all Mass Effect all the time.
or Animal Crossing.
Right.
Virtual reality.
I also think that it's a convenient place for small studios with small budgets to try to do something, because if they have a good idea, they can execute it on it fairly quickly without worrying about creating a lot of spaces that can be time consuming and coming up with a narrative. They can make the procedural generation and throw you in there. So it's once you can do that part, it's a game that you can make on a lower budget that is still very enjoyable.
Next question. So, when creating a dungeon crawler, we've mentioned both mobile monsters and static monsters, and I suppose we can throw traps into that same sort of genre. Do you think it's important? Is there a sweet spot between mobile and immobile, or should it just be a kitchen sink approach to populating your dungeons?
I feel as though, again, it depends on what sort of dungeon crawler you're going for and what your ancillary fantasies are. If you think of Myst and sort of treat it as though we're a dungeon crawler, like consider it in the dungeon crawler space, then you have no mobs. All you have is traps and puzzles, right? But then on the other hand, when you think of some other games like Dark Souls is very monster focused, and that's because the fantasy around Myst is that like you're an explorer and a discoverer, and the fantasy around Dark Souls is that you're an awesome fighter person, or mage person. And so because of that, I feel as though the balance that you want to hit depends more on what experience you're trying to give rather than a formula that you put stuff in and you get the right number of encounters out.
I was going to say, dude, the meta is totally mage. Anybody else want to add anything on that?
I wanted to say Brennan has used the word fantasy multiple times, and I think it would be worth clarifying. You're talking about the fantasy aesthetic of play, where you are playing the game as a make-believe, where you pretend to be another person. So this isn't necessarily swords and wizards. This could be football players. It could be space invaders, right? But the fantasy is that you are coming to the game for that experience of being someone else. And so when Brennan says, which fantasy are you trying to invoke in your game, the explorer from Myst or the fighter from Dark Souls, that's what he's referring to.
Got anything, Brian? Okay. I want to add that I want to answer this one from a tabletop designer's point of view, and that is that your story should probably entirely dictate your answer here. Now, you still want to have game balance, but if you are doing a locale where creatures are popping into existence in every room for the entertainment of some mad god, they're not going to move around that much, right? If you're doing a castle where one alarm and they have to fight every single living creature in that castle that is combat capable, that's a whole other kind of experience. And you just need to take that into account when you're setting it up. The locale kind of helps you dictate how that's going to be. And you set up the difficulty of the challenges accordingly based on how you expect Charlie is going to dance that foxtrot. So, yeah. Okay, great. Let's have another question.
So, this one's actually going to come from me.
All right, great.
Mimic or no mimic? What's your thoughts on that? And if yes, mimic, are we going standard D&D style mimic where it's just a nasty monster, or Dark Souls mimic where it will kill you in an instant?
My Neverwinter guild would, like, part of our goal was to kill other guild members with mimics as often as possible.
All potions looted should have a 1% chance of being a mimic in a bottle.
I feel as though you should have a mimic themed area where just like everything's trying to get you. Like the door tries to get you, the floor tries to get you, the chest tries to get you, the exit switch tries to get you. But then besides that, lay off it. If players know that they're in an area with a mimic, then they will act differently. And sometimes that's really fun. But you would need to encapsulate that within a small portion of gameplay, so they don't act like that all the time. They just act like that within one dungeon.
You have one, and it's a surprise. One of my favorite moments is when a guy listened to the door, and the door was a mimic. And he's got his ear stuck to the door's punching him in his face. It's very funny. Or, like, as you were saying, it's the whole thing. Like, Prey is one of my favorite computer games. And my favorite room in Prey is the one where the guy has placed a Post-it note on everything he's sure isn't a mimic. And you just walk into the room, and, like, 90% of the things have a Post-it note on that says, not a mimic. You're looking really carefully at all the last 10% of the things.
And on the topic of mimics in Dark Souls, I kind of like that dynamic. It slowed you down when you reached the chest, right? And so it made the chest feel more special because you knew that was the only place you could meet a mimic.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, we are right at the end of our time. Let's have everybody give a final thought, and we will wrap up for the night. Brian, why don't we start with you, because we haven't heard from you for a little bit. Have a final thought?
Final thought for the night. I really enjoyed this panel because it helped me relive a little bit of my youth, and now I want to go relive a little bit more of it. And now I've got to figure out what to replay first. And I want to start with the old stuff, not the new stuff, except for Final Fantasy VII Remake. So
yeah, I really like Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Yeah,
James,
that's now going to be at the top of my list, is that remake. So
I found that with compatibility issues, it can be hard to find the old stuff. But if you've been in this panel listening to what we're doing, what we're talking about, and you're thinking, I would like to play those types of games, Bard's Tale 4 recaptures some of that nostalgia, and the two Legend of Grimrock games really, really tried to recapture the original, grid-based real-time dungeon crawler.
Before I go to Brennan, producer, do we have any rules about putting links to products in the chat over in LTUE, in the general chat?
Nope, no rules against it, just don't spam like usual.
Brennan, could you, when as part of, or if you're in the main thing, can you put your game? Thank you. Great. Why don't you give us your final thought while I get that in, because I didn't have this type the name right.
Dungeons are great because they are a way for a game designer to have some, slightly tighter control over a player's experience, because when you've got walls and doors, it's a very easy choice, and you can really make an experience your own. Even if you don't have, as a game designer, a specific dungeon that you go through, thinking of games in terms of dungeons, I think, can help you tailor a game's target fantasy and experience to be more closely what you want it to be, in order to better hit your players and give them the enjoyment that you're hoping they'll have. It's my final thought. Also,
awesome.
Final Winter is on Steam.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for our panelists. I hope that everybody will seek out all their other panels and maybe buy. Is this game actually available yet, or is it just wish list?
Came out 8 days ago today.
Awesome, great. I aren't seeing a buy button. Okay, I might not be logged in right. Okay, but it's definitely going to get it on my wish list, and I'm going to buy it as soon as I find where the buy button is. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy your evenings, and we'll see you all at our next panels.